When an unsuspecting mailman in the quiet town of Fairview crossed paths with a terrified young girl, the first words out of her mouth sent chills down his spine. What seemed like a frightened cry for help at first took a sinister turn as the pieces began to unravel, revealing a dark truth, one that put her life and her family in unimaginable danger. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Mike Gibbs walked the same route every weekday morning. He had done so for years, delivering letters, postcards, and packages to the residents of Fairview. The town itself was modest, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Stoops were often decorated with potted plants or wind chimes, and friendly dogs would bark from behind fences, eager for a pat on the head. Mike enjoyed the routine. There was a certain solace in doing the same thing day after day, greeting the same people, seeing the same houses with their small changes, like a new mailbox or fresh paint on the shutters. He was a man of few words. Some in town said he was shy, others assumed he just preferred to be alone. But inside Mike's reserved exterior was a steady and dependable heart, one that found fulfillment in making sure the mail got to the right place, come rain or shine. He had grown used to the hush of early mornings, the smell of dew on freshly cut grass, and the quiet companionship of stepping onto each porch. However, on that fateful day, the calm felt slightly off. A chill wind blew, causing the branches of maple trees to sway more forcefully than usual, and the skies were heavy with thick gray clouds that promised a downpour by noon. There was a stillness in the air, a kind of anticipation that Mike couldn't quite name. The usual birdsong seemed muted, as if even the sparrows had found reason to hush. He continued on, delivering envelopes and circulars with a gentle efficiency, glancing occasionally over his shoulder in response to a feeling he couldn't explain. When he turned onto the path leading toward the old community center, a place that rarely received mail but was on his route regardless, he saw someone standing under the small awning. It was a slight figure, shoulders trembling, small hands wrapped around her arms as if she were trying to hold herself together. As Mike got closer, he realized it was a girl, no older than 11 or 12. Her blonde hair was tangled, her face drawn. The sight of her was startling, because she shouldn't have been there alone, especially so early in the morning. He hesitated, uncertain of the correct protocol. He was just a mailman, not a teacher, not a policeman, not even a particularly outgoing neighbor. Yet something about the girl's posture tugged at his conscience. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. He cleared his throat softly to announce his presence, and she spun around, eyes wide, as if she had been caught in some silent horror. For a moment neither spoke. Then Mike mustered a gentle, "Are you all right?" The girl didn't respond immediately. She looked at him as though she was trying to decide if he was trustworthy, if she could speak the words that were clearly stuck in her throat. Finally she managed, "Please, I need help." Her voice trembled, her body visibly shaking. Mike felt his heart skip. He had never heard such desperation come from a child in Fairview, where life was typically so ordinary and unremarkable. "What's wrong?" he asked softly, trying to mask the unease that was slowly rising in his own chest. She opened her mouth, but her words caught on a sob. "My name is Sophie Warren," she said at last. "I don't know who else to tell. Please help me." He noticed she was barefoot, her socks muddied and torn, as though she had run a great distance. His first thought was that she was lost, maybe a runaway, but the gravity in her gaze told him it was something else. "Sophie," he said gently, "my name is Mike. Let me call someone for you. The police, maybe." She flinched at the mention of the police, and tears collected at the corners of her eyes. "Don't tell them yet," she whispered, her voice raw with fear. "Not until you know. My father, he hurt my mother. I'm sure of it." Mike felt something sink in his stomach. He had delivered mail for Brandon Warren before. He knew the name, recognized the house from his route. Brandon wasn't exactly friendly, but he wasn't known to be monstrous, either. Could this girl be telling the truth? Still, The sincerity in her tear-filled eyes was enough to banish any immediate doubt. "We can go to the nurse at the school," Mike said, remembering that Mrs. Reynolds, the longtime school nurse at Fairview Elementary, was known for handling crisis situations with compassion. "She'll know what to do. Are you hurt? Do you need a hospital?" Sophie shook her head, though she winced as if some part of her body ached. "I just need someone to believe me. He does terrible things. I'm scared and She trailed off, her thin arms hugging herself tighter. Mike's mind whirled with a dozen questions, but he decided they could wait until he got the child somewhere safe. "Let's go," he said gently. He removed his own jacket and placed it over her shoulders, realizing how cold she must be in the early morning air. In that moment, he felt a protective impulse arise within him, a willingness to take her under his wing, at least until he could deliver her to someone with more authority. If she was telling the truth, and he felt in his heart she was in grave danger. They made their way through the narrow streets of Fairview, the sound of Mike's steady footsteps echoing on the sidewalk alongside Sophie's light but hurried steps. With each block, Mike glanced over at her, wanting to offer some reassurance. The more he thought about it, the more he worried. If Sophie's father had done something horrible, might he be out looking for her even now? Sophie remained quiet as they approached the school. It was the time when buses usually arrived, and kids were shuffling in, excited for the day or dreading a test. The building itself loomed brick and squat, a place that should have felt safe. Mike guided her through the front entrance. Teachers and staff bustled about, but no one immediately questioned him. The presence of a postal worker seemed normal enough. Perhaps they assumed he was there to deliver packages or read the bulletin. One or two people gave the haggard Sophie a curious look but walked on when they saw Mike speaking softly to her. They found Mrs. Reynolds in her small office, the smell of antiseptic and cotton balls heavy in the air. She was a kind woman in her late 50s, with short, curly hair that was beginning to show strands of silver. She'd served as the school nurse for nearly 2 decades. "Hello there, Mike," she greeted brightly at first, but her tone shifted when she noticed Sophie. "Oh my goodness, what happened?" she asked, her brow furrowing as concern replaced her warm smile. Mike ushered Sophie into the office. "I found her near the community center," he explained in a low voice, aware that other staff might be listening in the hallway. "She says her father's abusive." She was terrified. "I didn't know what else to do but bring her here." Mrs. Reynolds let out a soft gasp and guided Sophie to sit on a small stool near a cabinet filled with bandages and other supplies. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what's going on?" she asked gently, her voice the embodiment of calm assurance. Sophie took a tremulous breath. "My father, Brandon Warren, he hurt my mother. I think he killed her," she said, her voice so small Mike leaned forward to catch every word. "I woke up last night, there was shouting. I heard my mother scream. Then, silence. When I tried to find her, he locked me in my room. I climbed out of the window. I had to see if she was okay, but I couldn't find her anywhere." Mrs. Reynolds' expression shifted, a blend of empathy and alarm. She glanced at Mike, and it was clear that her next words would be serious. "All right," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I'm going to call Child Protective Services and the police. We'll get this sorted out." Sophie's eyes welled with tears again, but she nodded, relieved that someone was taking her seriously. Mike placed a comforting hand on the girl's shoulder, trying to convey that she wasn't alone now. He could almost feel the tension rolling off of her in waves, the terror that she would not be believed or worse, that her father would find her. Mrs. Reynolds picked up the phone, and in a calm, methodical manner, she relayed the situation to the authorities. Mike stood with Sophie, waiting in silence. He could hear the nurse providing every detail, from Sophie's name to the allegations that Brandon Warren had harmed his wife. By the time she ended the call, a heavy quiet settled in the small office. "All right, we'll wait here," Mrs. Reynolds said. "The police and a social worker are on their way. They'll help you, Sophie. You're safe with us." Sophie tried to smile, but it was a wavering, uncertain smile. She clutched the edges of Mike's jacket like a lifeline, pressing it closer around her small frame. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was so scared." Mike nodded, kneeling next to her. "I'm glad you found me," he said. "You did the right thing." Even as he said the words, doubt flickered in his mind. What if they had been too late? What if the worst had already happened to Sophie's mother? The possibility felt like a stone in his chest. Within half an hour, 2 police officers arrived, along with a representative from Child Protective Services. A swirl of activity followed, questions asked, official forms filled, phone calls made to verify Sophie's identity. Mike stood to the side, trying to answer what he could about how he had found her, though he knew very little about the specifics. Sophie's voice trembled as she recounted her story. The officers' stern faces betrayed shock and concern, but they maintained a professional composure. They took Sophie into protective custody, explaining gently that she would be placed with a foster family for the time being, for her own safety. As they led her out of the nurse's office, Mike caught a final glimpse of her, still wrapped in his jacket. "I'm going to stay in touch," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how. They had only just met, but something about this child, her bravery in the face of terror, made him feel responsible. A day later, news spread through Fairview like wildfire. Sarah Warren, Sophie's mother, was missing. The police considered Brandon Warren a suspect. When they went to the Warren residence, they found signs of a struggle and what appeared to be bloodstains on the living room carpet. Brandon was nowhere to be found. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Mike watched from the periphery as the investigation roiled on. Red and blue lights flashed outside the Warren home for days, uniformed officers combed the house and nearby woodland, and the people of Fairview whispered to each other in hushed tones about the quiet father who might have killed his wife. A few weeks after that, the local news stations announced that a body had been found in a wooded area a few miles outside town. Dental records confirmed it was Sarah Warren. She had been murdered. The entire town was stunned, but no one felt the blow quite as deeply as Sophie, who had been placed in a temporary foster home. Word filtered around that she was inconsolable, devastated by the loss of her mother, racked with guilt that she had not done more. The heartbreak of losing a parent under such horrifying circumstances would be unimaginable for anyone, let alone a child. And then there was the ever-looming question, where was Brandon Warren? For many residents, Fairview seemed a little less safe. Windows that were once left open at night were now carefully locked. The friendly greetings became more guarded. Rumors swirled that Brandon Warren had fled to another state, or that he was hiding in the wooded areas surrounding Fairview, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Mike felt uneasy every time he left his house in the early morning darkness to start his route, his senses on high alert as though expecting a figure to jump out from behind the trees. Yet, despite his own fears, he found himself consumed with concern for Sophie. He contacted Child Protective Services, stepping far beyond the usual boundaries for a simple mailman, and explained that he wanted to check on her well-being. At first, the social worker assigned to Sophie's case was cautious. Mike was a stranger, albeit a well-intentioned one. But after a series of conversations, and with Sophie's clear consent, Mike was allowed to visit her, on the condition that a social worker or foster parent was present to supervise. He remembered the first time he visited her in the foster home. The house belonged to a kind couple named Karen and Peter Marshall, who were in their late 40s and had fostered many children over the years. They welcomed Mike warmly, though with a bit of watchfulness. Sophie was in the living room, curled up on an armchair, doodling with colored pencils. When she saw Mike, she broke into a shy grin. "You came," she said, her voice soft but laced with gratitude. "Of course I did," Mike replied, removing his coat and sitting across from her. "How are you holding up?" She shrugged, setting aside her sketchbook. "I'm okay, I guess. I just keep thinking about my mom. I miss her so much." Tears shone in her eyes, but she took a breath and steadied herself. Mike nodded, his own heart heavy. "I can't imagine how hard that must be. But I want you to know that you have people who care about you. Mrs. Reynolds at the school asked about you. And I'm sure Karen and Peter are taking good care of you." Sophie nodded, glancing around at the cozy living room. There were photos on the mantel of other children who had passed through the marshal's care over the years. "They're nice," Sophie said. It's not home." "I know," Mike said softly. "But it might be for a while. So maybe you can make it your own." She took up her colored pencils and flipped to a fresh page in her sketchbook. With a shaky hand, she began to draw a simple house, reminiscent of a childlike portrait. Mike watched with interest, noticing how each stroke seemed tentative, as though she were trying to recall what safety felt like. In that moment, he made a silent promise to her that he would do whatever he could to help. Weeks passed, and the investigation into Sarah Warren's murder continued. The police worked tirelessly, following leads that pointed toward Brandon Warren fleeing the state, but they kept coming up short. Then, a stroke of luck, or fate, changed everything. Brandon was spotted in a neighboring town, trying to rent a room in a shabby motel under an assumed name. Someone recognized him from the wanted posters that had circulated, and within an hour, the police converged on the location. A short chase ensued, culminating in Brandon's arrest. He was brought back to Fairview under heavy suspicion of murder and child abuse. Word spread fast through the small community. On the day of Brandon's arraignment, the courthouse was packed with onlookers. Mike didn't attend, but he saw the news reports. The camera captured Brandon being led into the courthouse in handcuffs, his eyes flicking nervously from left to right, as though scanning the crowd for a possible escape route. In that moment, Mike felt an odd sense of relief. At least Sophie would be safe now, or as safe as any child could be while grappling with the trauma of losing a parent to murder, and nearly losing her own life to an abuser. The trial was not a swift process, but eventually, Brandon Warren was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to decades behind bars, a punishment that reflected the brutality of his crime. In the aftermath, the legal system moved quickly to sever his parental rights. Sophie, who had just turned 12, became eligible for adoption. The marshals, seeing how she had begun to bond with them, eventually started the adoption process, wanting to give her the stable home she desperately needed. Mike watched this unfold with a mixture of hope and sadness. He continued to visit Sophie, forging a connection that felt deeper than mere friendship. Though he had never married or had children of his own, he found himself wanting to ensure Sophie's well-being. She started calling him Uncle Mike, a term of endearment that, while informal, touched him in ways he couldn't fully express. An entire year passed. Sophie's hair grew longer, her face lost some of the gauntness that had marked her initial arrival in the foster home, and she no longer jumped at every sound in the night. She began to excel in school, particularly in art classes, where she poured her grief and fears onto canvases and papers. Her teachers praised her for her talent, and though the subject of her drawings was often dark, depicting silhouettes, abandoned houses, and swirling clouds, she was at least expressing her trauma in a healthier way. During that time, Mike remained a steadfast presence. He came to her school events. He introduced her to his cat, a fluffy calico named Willow, who let Sophie pet her until she purred contentedly. He listened patiently whenever Sophie needed to talk about her mother's memory or her lingering nightmares of her father. Through it all, he offered simple, unwavering support. Over time, a genuine bond formed between them. Sophie's formal adoption by the marshals was finalized shortly after her 12th birthday. It was a quiet affair in the courthouse, just a few close friends. Mike was there, standing with the marshals, who had grown to trust him implicitly. After the paperwork was signed and the judge offered his congratulations, Sophie's eyes shone with tears. "I have a real family again," she whispered as she hugged Karen and Peter. Then she turned to Mike, hugging him, too. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved me." Mike's voice caught in his throat. "I'm just glad I was in the right place at the right time," he replied, returning her hug. "And I'm proud of you." If things had ended there, it would have been the story of a tragic event that was, in some small way, set right. Sophie could have moved on, healing slowly in the arms of her new family, supported by the quiet and steadfast mailman who had come to her rescue. But fate had other plans, ones that would shake the fragile security Sophie had begun to build. Late one night, nearly 18 months after Brandon Warren had been sent to prison, news broke that he had escaped. It happened during a routine transfer to a different facility. Details were murky, but the result was clear. He had fled, and nobody knew where he was. The authorities launched an immediate manhunt, setting up roadblocks, searching surrounding areas, and urging the public to remain vigilant. The entire state was on high alert, and once again the tension in Fairview spiked to levels not felt since the days leading up to Brandon's capture. Sophie found out the following morning. A police officer and a social worker came to the marshal's home to inform them of the situation and to advise them on additional security measures. The officer spoke gently, but the words struck Sophie like a thunderbolt. "We believe he may attempt to make contact," the officer said. "He might want to harm Sophie or try to take her." Karen clutched Sophie protectively. "How could he possibly get out?" she demanded. "Wasn't he under maximum security?" The officer shook his head. "He was being moved to a facility that had different protocols. Something happened during the transfer. We don't know the exact details, but we're searching for him now. We have officers in the area, and the FBI has been notified. Try not to panic, but stay vigilant." Try not to panic. The words echoed ominously. How could they not panic? Sophie, who had finally begun to sleep through the night without nightmares, now found herself catapulted back into fear. The marshals agreed to have a police car stationed outside their home, at least until Brandon was caught, and they made sure Sophie's school was alerted. Security measures were put in place there, too. Mike was delivering mail that morning when he heard the news. He nearly dropped his mailbag in shock. Immediately, he rushed to the marshal's house, skipping the last few deliveries on his route. The policeman outside recognized him and allowed him in, given the role he had played in Sophie's life. He found her curled up on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, trembling. Karen and Peter sat on either side, trying to comfort her. She looked up at Mike, her eyes filled with anguish. "He's out," she whispered. "He's coming for me." Mike squatted down beside her, speaking in a calm tone. "We don't know that for sure," he said gently, though in his heart he feared she might be right. "The police and the FBI are on it, and you're not alone this time. We'll do everything to keep you safe." She clung to him, and for a moment, Mike felt the weight of that responsibility pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had never felt particularly heroic, had never wanted to be in such a situation. Yet, looking at Sophie, he knew he would stand in Brandon Warren's path if it came down to it. In the days that followed, life in Fairview became suffused with a tension that no one could shake. Every rumor of a sighting turned into frantic phone calls and surges of police activity. Some people claimed to have seen a man fitting Brandon's description near an abandoned motel off the highway, while others claimed he had fled across the state line. The authorities seemed unsure of where he might be. Meanwhile, Sophie tried to continue her life as normally as possible, going to school, attending therapy sessions, but it was hard. She had trouble concentrating, her mind drifting to dark possibilities. Mike visited often, walking with her to school in the mornings, when scheduling allowed, and sometimes dropping by in the evenings. He and the marshals had formed an informal system. No one left Sophie alone, not even for a moment. At night, the doors were double-locked. The windows were checked and rechecked. Yet an undercurrent of dread permeated the house. Every creak in the floorboards or rustle of the wind outside sparked the same question: could that be Brandon? 2 weeks passed, and there was no sign of him. Some began to hope he had given up on whatever vengeance or twisted longing he had, that maybe he was on the run, trying to hide from the law. Then, on a cold Wednesday night, everything changed. Mike was awakened by a shrill ring of his phone at a little past midnight. He fumbled for it, heart pounding from the abrupt disturbance. On the other end, Karen's voice was frantic. "He's gone. Sophie's gone." Mike sat up, every fiber of his being jolting awake. "What? What happened?" His voice quivered despite himself. "We don't know," Karen cried. "We heard a sound. Peter went to check. By the time he got to Sophie's room, she was gone." The window was open, the curtains torn. There's no sign of her. The police are on their way. Mike felt as if ice water had been poured down his spine. I'm coming over, he said, already yanking on his clothes. He didn't think twice about the dangerous implications of traveling through town alone at such an hour. His only thought was of Sophie, abducted from her bed by the one person she had every reason to fear. The moment he hung up, he dashed out the door, hopped on his bicycle. His old car had been out of commission for months, and pedaled furiously through the dark streets. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the wind whipped at his face. He hardly felt it. When he arrived, the marshal's home was ablaze with lights. A police cruiser sat in the driveway, and 2 officers were inside taking statements. Karen stood in the living room, tears streaming down her cheeks, while Peter paced, fists clenched in helpless rage. "Mike!" Karen cried when she saw him. "He took her. How could this happen? We had a police car outside until 11. Then they left, thinking she was safe for the night." Peter's voice was thick with anger. "They shouldn't have left. She's just a child." One of the officers tried to be comforting. "We've already got men searching the area. We'll coordinate with the FBI. We'll find her." Mike scanned the room, as if expecting Sophie might appear if he just looked hard enough. Then he asked quietly, "Did he leave anything? Any note?" The officer shook his head grimly. "Not that we can see. We'll do a thorough check once the investigators arrive. We're expecting them any minute." Outside, the wind howled. The yard was dimly lit by a single lamp near the front porch, and the gate leading to the backyard was ajar, swaying on squeaky hinges. It looked like someone had forced it open. Mike felt his breathing quicken. Sophie was out there somewhere, with a man who had already proven he was capable of murder. A swirl of activity consumed the next hour. More police arrived, accompanied by an FBI agent who took the lead in the search. Flashlights and shouting filled the quiet suburban streets as officers fanned out, canvassing neighbors, searching nearby yards, checking local roads. But it soon became clear that Brandon had planned this carefully. There was no sign of them. They had vanished, melting into the night like shadows. For the next 2 days, the entire region was on high alert. There were news bulletins on TV. Flyers with Sophie's picture circulated. People who had hardly ever locked their doors now triple-locked them, staying up through the night with anxiety clawing at their chests. Fairview felt like a small boat in the midst of a raging storm, helpless and vulnerable. Mike could hardly sleep. Each morning, he reported to the marshal's house or the police station, begging for updates. Each time, he received the same grim reply. "No leads yet, but we're doing everything we can." He felt a gnawing frustration. Sophie had become like a niece or a daughter to him, someone he cherished deeply. He couldn't bear the thought of her in Brandon's clutches, living a nightmare she had once escaped. On the second night after her abduction, a breakthrough came. An anonymous tip led the FBI to a remote cabin in the outskirts of the next county. It was nestled among thick pines and a winding dirt road that few people traveled. The cabin had apparently been rented under a false name just days before Brandon's prison break. Now, they had reason to believe Sophie was being held there. In the dead of night, a convoy of FBI agents, local police, and a few state troopers approached the area quietly, their vehicles stopping a half-mile away to avoid alerting Brandon. They moved in on foot, the glow of flashlights dancing among the darkened trunks of pine trees. There was an almost tangible tension in the air, a silent expectation that the worst could happen at any moment. Mike, who had begged to come along, was held back by the authorities, who insisted it was too dangerous. He waited at a command post set up at a small clearing near a service road, pacing restlessly under the watchful eye of a stern-faced officer. He could see, through the trees, the faint flicker of lights moving in formation toward the cabin. After what felt like an eternity, he heard raised voices echo through the woods. Then came a tense standstill. One of the officers sprinted back toward the command post. "We've got him cornered," the officer said breathlessly. "He's barricaded inside, says he won't let Sophie go." Mike's heart hammered. "He has to let her go. he said, desperation cracking his voice. "What is he thinking? He can't just. He's not thinking rationally," the officer interrupted grimly. "We're trying to negotiate." Mike stared into the darkness, wishing he could be there, could do something to help. Minutes ticked by. A negotiator attempted to reason with Brandon, calling out through a bullhorn for him to surrender peacefully, to let Sophie walk out. Only silence came from within the cabin. Finally, after more back and forth that led nowhere, the FBI agents prepared to move in. Mike heard the faint sound of glass breaking, then men shouting. His imagination filled in the horrifying blanks. Brandon might be threatening Sophie, maybe holding something to her throat. A wave of helplessness crashed over Mike as he stood there, forced to remain in the periphery while her life hung in the balance. He prayed silently, pleading with a higher power he never much appealed to before. Suddenly, there was a surge of movement. Through the tall pines, silhouettes flitted across the narrow beams of artificial light. Mike could only make out fragments, a shape lunging forward, a door being kicked in, bodies colliding. Shouts and grunts carried on the night air, a chaotic scuffle that seemed to last forever. He heard someone yell Sophie's name, then he heard Sophie scream. His heart pounded so violently that his vision blurred. The next moments were a swirl of confusion. The FBI took Brandon by surprise in a desperate confrontation, pinning him to the cabin floor. He fought back wildly, refusing to be subdued. It was no quick takedown. Agents had to wrestle him, fists flying, as he resisted with an almost inhuman ferocity. At one point, he twisted free, lunging for an exit. Another agent tackled him, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of their struggle. The sound of fists connecting, of bodies slamming into cabin walls, echoed in the night. Finally, Brandon was pinned, one of his legs twisted beneath him in such a way that a sickening snap resounded. With a howl of pain, he collapsed. Before he could scramble away, 3 agents were on him. He was handcuffed, rendered powerless. The massive surge of adrenaline that had fueled him subsided, leaving him gasping, his eyes wild. In the same moment, Sophie stumbled out of a side room, sobbing uncontrollably. She was trembling from head to toe. One of the agents gently guided her outside, away from Brandon's line of sight, wrapping a blanket around her. She was shaken but alive, free from immediate harm. The rescue that had felt so precarious was, at last, accomplished. Word reached the command post. A young officer sprinted back, gave a thumbs up to everyone gathered. "They've got him!" he cried. "Sophie's safe!" Mike felt as though the ground had given out from under him, replaced by a rush of relief so intense it stole his breath. He let out a strangled cry of gratitude. "Thank God," he whispered, tears pricking his eyes. The tension that had gripped him for so long began to ease, replaced by a throbbing desire to see Sophie, to hold her and assure her it was over. When they finally allowed Mike to approach, he found Sophie sitting on the steps of the cabin, flanked by 2 agents. She clutched a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes wide and distant, as though still processing what had happened. The second she saw Mike, she leaped up and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. He wrapped her in a tight embrace, feeling her small frame shake. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "You're safe now." She buried her face against him, muffling her sobs in his shirt. Time seemed to stand still as he held her there under the dark canopy of trees, the smell of pine mingling with the electric tang of stress and fear. Agents bustled around them, and Brandon was carried away on a stretcher, moaning in pain from his broken leg. No one in Fairview slept easy that night, but there was a collective sigh of relief that the ordeal had ended. Sophie was taken to a local hospital for examination, and she clung to Mike's hand as doctors inspected her for injuries. She had bruises on her arms, consistent with being grabbed forcefully. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed with red from crying. The doctors recommended rest, therapy, and plenty of support. For the second time in her short life, Sophie had survived a direct confrontation with the father who had destroyed her childhood. Brandon was transferred to a high-security medical ward, his leg in a cast, his future filled with new charges for abduction and assault. There would be no escaping this time, no leniency from the justice system. Although the immediate danger was gone, the emotional toll was far from healed. Over the following days, Sophie stayed close to Mike and the marshals, who hovered protectively. Even though it was over, the echoes of what she'd been through remained. She would wake at night, screaming, convinced Brandon was still out there, waiting. Each time, either Karen or Peter or Mike was there to soothe her, whispering that she was safe, that he couldn't hurt her anymore. For Mike, the events changed something deep within him as well. He had always been quiet, but now he felt a deeper sense of purpose. He understood how fragile safety could be, how precarious life's small comforts were. He took extended time off from his mail route, with the blessing of his supervisors, who recognized the trauma he had faced. When he returned, he did so with a renewed resolve to be vigilant, to never assume that the surface of a peaceful town told the whole story. As for Sophie, she spent long hours with a therapist, who specialized in trauma. She poured her pain into her drawings, producing images that were haunting but also cathartic, images of dark forests, a single glowing lantern, an open window in a lonely cabin. Gradually, she learned to believe that Brandon's capture was real, that he was back behind bars, this time likely for the rest of his life. The final step of her journey out of fear happened about a month after her rescue. There was an informal gathering at the marshal's house. A few of Sophie's friends from school, some neighbors, Mike, and even Mrs. Reynolds, the school nurse who had first contacted authorities. They came together to celebrate her safe return. It was a modest event, just grilled food, some balloons, and a few homemade signs that read, "Welcome home, Sophie." She didn't like too much attention, but it felt comforting to be surrounded by those who cared about her. She stood in the backyard, away from the small crowd, looking at the sky. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in soft pinks and oranges, a color palette that felt hopeful. Mike approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "How are you doing?" he asked gently. Sophie turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of dusk. "Better," she said. "It's weird, everything is the same, but also different. I know he can't hurt me now, but sometimes I still feel afraid. Like I can't believe it's really over." Mike nodded. "That's normal," he said. "You've been through a lot, Sophie. It'll take time to feel safe again. But you are safe, I promise." She let out a soft sigh. "I believe you. It's just going to take a while for my brain to catch up." She glanced over her shoulder at the modest gathering. Karen was flipping burgers on the grill, and Peter was talking to some neighbors about adding more security measures around the house. "They've done so much for me," Sophie continued, her voice cracking slightly. "And so have you." "Thank you." Mike rested a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. You've been brave. Braver than most adults I know." He gave her a small smile. "Besides, you give me something to look forward to every day. Seeing you safe and living your life, that's more than enough, thanks." She managed a tiny laugh, the first real laugh he had heard from her since the ordeal. They stood there together, watching the sky darken, the cicadas humming in the distance. Little by little, the rest of the group drifted over, plates in hand, encouraging Sophie to join in the small celebration. Lights strung across the yard glowed softly, lending a tranquil glow to the evening. Eventually, Mrs. Reynolds approached Sophie, wrapping her in a warm hug. "Look at you," she said, smiling gently. "I always knew you'd pull through this. You're strong." Sophie blushed, and used to so much positive attention, but she accepted the hug, clinging to the older woman for a moment. It felt safe. Later, after the sun had fully set and the fireflies began their nightly dance, the marshals brought out a small cake they had purchased from the local bakery. It wasn't exactly a birthday or an anniversary, but it felt right to have something sweet to mark a new chapter, the start of a life that wouldn't be overshadowed by Brandon's presence. As they sliced the cake, Sophie stared at the swirled icing, thinking about how symbolic it felt, a fresh slice, a sweet taste, something new and pure. When she took her first bite, she closed her eyes and let the sugary flavor wash over her. In that moment, she vowed silently to embrace hope. Yes, she would still have nightmares sometimes. She would still feel that pang of loss when she thought of her mother. And she would still occasionally glance over her shoulder, remembering how fragile security could be. But she had survived, and in her survival, she found a spark of purpose, to live fully, to let her art speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves, to perhaps one day help someone else caught in a nightmare. Mike watched her from a short distance, nibbling on his slice of cake. He couldn't read her thoughts, but he saw the tranquil look in her eyes, the small smile gracing her lips. She had come so far from that terrified girl standing under the awning at the community center. He felt pride swell in his chest. He had done what he could, but most of all, Sophie had fought for her own life, for her own future. She was the reason she was still here. As the evening wore on and guests began to trickle away, Sophie found herself standing next to Mike once more. Fireflies flickered near the bushes, and the low murmur of conversation drifted in from the patio. For a moment, they simply stood in companionable silence, listening to the sounds of summer nights in Fairview. Then Sophie asked, "Will you always be around?" Mike considered the question. He knew it stemmed from a place of deep insecurity, a child who had lost so much and had her life upended time and time again. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Unless you're sick of me and my visits." She shook her head firmly. "No. I just want to know you'll be here." He gently ruffled her hair. "I will be," he said. "As long as you need me." A small smile touched her lips. "I'm glad," she said. "You make me feel safe." They didn't say anything else for a while, just took in the gentle glow of the fireflies and the hum of crickets. In that silence, unspoken words of gratitude and love passed between them. Sophie had a new family, but Mike was still a vital part of her life, a steadfast force that had guided her towards safety twice. She would always remember the gentle warmth in his eyes, the sturdy presence that told her she wasn't alone. Days flowed into weeks. Summer moved toward autumn. Sophie started a new school year, something that felt almost normal after the chaos. She began painting more intricate pieces, images that spoke of transformation, monarch butterflies emerging from cocoons, phoenixes rising from ashes. Her teachers noticed a brightening in her demeanor. Though she still had the occasional panic attack, especially around strangers who resembled Brandon, she had coping mechanisms now. Therapy sessions continued, helping her navigate the complexities of life after trauma. Mike settled back into his routine of delivering mail, though he felt a subtle shift within himself. He was no longer content to live in quiet solitude. He began striking up small conversations with people on his route, took an interest in local community events. The Marshalls invited him over for dinner now and then, an invitation he gladly accepted. In the solace of those meals, he found a sense of belonging that had been missing from his life. The old wound of loneliness that had once fit him like a second skin was beginning to heal. Meanwhile, Brandon Warren's broken leg eventually mended behind bars. His injuries forced him to rely on medical care within the prison, but that was the least of his concerns. His additional criminal charges for abduction, assault, and evading the law solidified a lengthy, perhaps permanent, prison stay. The possibility of him ever walking free again was nearly non-existent, especially with the FBI and local law enforcement monitoring every aspect of his incarceration. He became just another cautionary tale in the annals of Fairview's history, a man so consumed by darkness that he destroyed his own family. Sophie's story, however, did not end in darkness. Over the course of that year, she and the Marshalls grew closer. They navigated the joys and challenges of being a family, arguments about chores, laughter over silly movies, bonding during weekend outings to the park. Sophie knew she would always miss her mother, and the circumstances of Sarah's death would forever cast a shadow. But she also understood that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering and finding a way to keep living, loving, and hoping. One afternoon, Sophie visited the community center where Mike had first found her. It was a deliberate choice, a pilgrimage of sorts. She walked through the old building, past appealing posters advertising art classes and dance lessons, and stood under that worn awning. She tried to recall the terror she had felt that day, the raw desperation that had led her to beg a stranger for help. The memory made her heart flutter uneasily, but it also filled her with gratitude. "I'm alive," she whispered to the empty space. "I survived." The wind rustled in the trees as if in agreement. By the time she returned home, she felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. It was as though she had reclaimed that memory, rendering it less powerful by facing it head-on. She resolved to channel her experiences into something that might help others, maybe an art exhibition one day, or a series of workshops for kids who had been through trauma. She was still young, but she had found her purpose. Surviving was just the first step. Thriving was the next. And so life in Fairview resumed its gentle rhythms. The seasons passed, each bringing small transformations to the town and its people. Yet beneath the surface calm, there was an awareness that tragedy could strike anywhere, even in a quiet place where mail routes rarely changed and neighbors exchanged friendly nods. But there was also a renewed sense of community, a willingness to look out for one another, to intervene when something seemed wrong, to offer a helping hand to a frightened child. Mike continued on his route, but with a lighter heart and a steady smile. He would pass the marshal's house each morning, greeting them if they were outside, sometimes exchanging a friendly wave with Sophie if she was awake early. He watched her grow from a frightened girl into a resilient teenager, her eyes filled with determination. He quietly cherished every small milestone, when she earned an A on a school project, when she made a new friend, when she laughed openly without a trace of fear. A few months after her abduction and rescue, Sophie came rushing out the front door one morning just as Mike was about to place the mail in the box. She was wearing pajamas and slippers, her hair a bit disheveled, but she had a grin on her face. "Mike!" she called, bounding down the steps. He turned, adjusting his mailbag. "Hey, Sophie. Everything okay?" She held out a piece of paper. It was a flyer for a student art competition at a regional level. "I entered!" she exclaimed, practically bubbling over with excitement. "I've been working on a painting for weeks. It's about finding light in the darkness. I based it on everything that happened, but I tried to make it about hope, too." Mike studied the flyer, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's amazing," he said. "I'm proud of you, Sophie. That takes courage." She blushed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just wanted to say thank you. For believing in me, for helping me, for everything." His voice turned gentle. "You're the one who did the hard work," he said. "All I did was answer when you called for help." She stepped closer, looking up at him with earnest eyes. "Yeah, but sometimes just showing up can change someone's entire life." Mike felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I guess it can," he agreed softly. They stood there for a moment, basking in the quiet warmth of mutual understanding. Then Sophie bounced back toward the house, waving goodbye as she went. Mike continued on his route, his steps a little lighter than before. Time rolled on, and the day of the competition arrived. Mike joined the marshals as they drove Sophie to the regional art gallery in a nearby city. The building was filled with student artworks from all over the county, paintings, sculptures, mixed media pieces. Sophie's painting was hung in a prominent spot, depicting a lone figure standing in a dark forest with a faint glow emerging from behind the trees. It was striking in its contrasts, exuding both fear and a blossoming sense of hope. Karen and Peter praised her technique, while Mike was drawn in by the emotional weight of the piece. He recognized the forest as if it were the nightmare Sophie had lived through. Sophie didn't win first place, but she received an honorable mention, enough to make her beam with pride. Afterward, they all went out to a small diner to celebrate, their laughter echoing off the vinyl seats and formica tabletops. Sophie's eyes shone with excitement, and Mike couldn't help but think this was what it meant to truly live, embracing victories both big and small, surrounded by people who cared. As they clinked glasses of soda in a toast to her success, Sophie spoke up. "I think I want to do more with my art. Maybe I can give some paintings to charities that help kids. You know, so other kids know they're not alone." Karen reached out, laying a hand over Sophie's. "That's a wonderful idea," she said softly. "I'm sure your work could inspire people." Peter nodded. Absolutely. We'll support you in any way we can. Mike added his agreement with a warm smile. I think you'd be amazing at that. Sophie felt her heart swell, and for a moment, the memory of Brandon's violence flickered in her mind. She'd been a terrified child, alone in the world, forced to rely on the kindness of a quiet stranger. Now she was on the cusp of something bigger, a future defined not by fear but by possibility. Thank you, she whispered, her throat tightening with gratitude. That was the essence of Sophie's new life, moments of creativity, the unwavering love of her adoptive parents, and the peaceful knowledge that the man who had once terrorized her was locked away for good. Although there would always be lingering nightmares, she had learned how to fight back against the darkness in her mind. She had learned that there were people who cared deeply for her, people like Mike, who had risked so much to ensure her safety. As for Mike, he continued to be part of Sophie's support system. There were still lunches, art shows, and occasional quiet moments spent sharing stories. He listened as she talked about her future ambitions, maybe attending an art program after high school, maybe volunteering at a local shelter, maybe traveling the world one day. Every dream she voiced was like a brilliant flower blooming after a long winter, a testament to how far she had come. Eventually, the investigators handling Brandon's new case contacted Sophie and the marshals to provide updates. He had received an additional sentence that effectively sealed his fate behind bars. There was a grim finality to it, yet also a sense of closure. Sophie wouldn't have to testify again. Her previous statements and evidence were enough. The relief was palpable. For once, the justice system felt like it had worked in favor of someone who desperately needed it. On a mild day in early spring, Mike took Sophie on a brief road trip to a calm lake an hour outside Fairview. Karen and Peter had given their blessing, trusting Mike implicitly. They arrived just after lunch, spreading a blanket near the water's edge. The lake shimmered under the gentle sun, tiny ripples catching the light. Lush greenery framed the shore, and a breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and the promise of warmer days to come. "Wow, it's so pretty," Sophie said, setting down her backpack. She pulled out her sketchbook and some pencils. Mike watched her find a spot near a small boulder, where she sat cross-legged, gazing out at the water. After a moment, he joined her, arms resting on his knees. The hush of the surroundings lent a tranquil aura to the moment. "You come here often?" Sophie asked, beginning a rough outline in her sketchbook. "Not really," Mike admitted. "But I've passed by a few times when I was younger. It always seemed peaceful." Sophie nodded, letting the stillness guide her strokes on the paper. She sketched the curve of the shoreline, the distant tree line, and the soft swirl of clouds reflected on the lake's surface. The more she drew, the more she felt her breathing slow, her pulse settle. Each pencil mark was a grounding act, a reminder that she was here, alive, safe. "What are you thinking about?" Mike asked gently. Sophie's pencil paused. "I'm thinking about how different my life is now," she said. "Back then, when I was in that cabin, I didn't think I'd see something like this again, peace, I mean. But here I am." She exhaled softly. "I'm so grateful." Mike placed a hand on her shoulder. "You deserve to feel at peace," he said. "You earned it." Her eyes lingered on the reflection of the clouds dancing across the water. "I just hope one day I can help someone else the way you helped me." "I have no doubt you will," Mike replied with a smile. "You already are, in your own way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. The air was crisp yet not unkind, a gentle embrace of spring's promise. When Sophie finished her sketch, she handed it to Mike. It showed the lake, but also two figures sitting side by side, small, rough details indicating one was bigger than the other. It was the two of them, gazing at the water. Mike felt his throat tighten. The sketch was simple, but full of emotion. He could see that she had captured the sense of safety, the closeness that had grown between them. "Thank you," he murmured. She shrugged, a little shy. "It's just a quick drawing." "It's perfect," he said sincerely. "I'll keep it." They spent the rest of the afternoon wandering around the lake's edge, talking about everything from her upcoming school projects to Mike's stories about his earliest days as a mail carrier. Sophie laughed when he recounted a mishap involving a dog that chased him for 2 blocks, all because he had a bag of jerky in his pocket. The tension in her eyes had eased, replaced by the easy warmth of a girl enjoying a day out with someone she trusted. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they returned to Fairview. The town was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, the shadows stretching long across the sidewalks. The day felt like a precious gift, a snapshot of what Sophie's life could be now that the darkest threats were behind her. Over the coming months, Sophie settled more deeply into her new normal. She made friends who saw her as more than just the girl who survived a terrible ordeal. She participated in after-school clubs, focusing on art, and sometimes even dabbling in drama. She found her voice in small ways, volunteering to read aloud in English class, joining group projects, and embracing the little challenges that used to terrify her. Each step forward was a testament to her resilience. Mike saw these changes firsthand. He attended her school's art showcases, clapping proudly from the back of the auditorium. He took her for ice cream on weekends, listening to her talk about teenage worries that, once upon a time, seemed trivial but now felt like a blessing compared to life-or-death nightmares. Through it all, he maintained his quiet presence, never pushing, never intruding, just letting her know he was there. Sometimes she still had bad days. A sudden loud noise would make her jump. A bad dream would have her call the marshals in the middle of the night, begging for reassurance. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. Gradually, the terror receded, leaving space for a future that wasn't defined by Brandon's shadow. One evening, about a year after her abduction and rescue, Sophie found herself sitting on the marshal's front porch with Mike and Karen. They were sipping lemonade and chatting about mundane topics, like the upcoming town fair and the minor leaks in the roof that Peter had been trying to fix. Karen excused herself to head inside, leaving Sophie and Mike alone for a moment. The summer air was thick with the scent of blooming gardenias, and fireflies flickered across the lawn. Sophie sighed contentedly. "I'm starting high school next semester," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "Crazy, right?" Mike smiled. "Time flies," he said. "I still remember the day I first saw you at the community center. Feels like yesterday." She glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the warm porch light. "I still have nightmares about that day sometimes," she admitted. "But I also think about how it led me to you, and to Karen and Peter. It's weird how life works." Mike nodded, setting down his glass of lemonade. "Sometimes good things come out of the worst situations," he said softly. Sophie was quiet for a moment, watching a firefly land on the arm of the porch swing. Then she spoke, her voice solemn. "I don't think I'll ever forgive my father. What he did is unforgivable. But I don't hate him anymore. Hating him feels like it gives him too much space in my life." "That's a brave perspective," Mike replied. "What do you feel instead?" "I feel sad for him," she said. "He lost everything because of his choices. And I lost my mom. But I can't let that define me. I have too much living to do." Mike smiled gently. "You're wise beyond your years," he said. "I'm proud of you, Sophie." A soft breeze ruffled her hair, and she gazed into the distance, where the darkness of the street merged with the faint glow of distant streetlights. "I'm proud of me, too," she whispered. Then she turned and offered him a small but genuine grin. "Thanks for always being around." He returned the smile, feeling a warmth in his chest that words couldn't fully express. "Anytime," he said. "Always." In that simple exchange, the unspoken truth between them shone as bright as the fireflies dancing in the yard. They had become like family. Not through blood, but through shared pain, shared courage, and the compassion that Mike had shown when a frightened girl first begged him for help. Their bond was deeper than any words could capture, a testament to how lives can be forever changed by a single act of kindness. The days continued, the seasons shifted. Sophie advanced in her studies, her art winning local contests. Mike remained her steadfast supporter, and the marshals gave her the loving environment she so desperately needed. The horrors inflicted by Brandon Warren would never be fully forgotten, but they lost their power to define her. And so, in the quiet town of Fairview, under skies that held both storms and sunshine, Sophie Warren found a measure of peace. She carried her scars, some visible only in her dreams, but she also carried a spirit of resilience that outshone any darkness her past could cast. Surrounded by those who loved her, her adoptive parents, her friends, and the quiet mailman who had stepped out of his solitary life to become her protector, she emerged stronger, braver, and ready to face whatever came next. At last, with Brandon securely behind bars and her nightmares growing ever more distant, Sophie allowed herself to truly hope for the future. She began to plan for the big things she once thought she'd never see: college, perhaps an art career, travel, and maybe even teaching art therapy to kids who had faced traumas of their own. She knew the road ahead would have challenges, but after everything she had endured, no obstacle seemed insurmountable. And through it all, Mike Gibbs was there, sometimes on the fringes, sometimes front and center, always available for a conversation, a reassuring presence, or a supportive hug. The man who had once been content to walk the same route day after day, hidden behind a stoic exterior, discovered the depths of his own capacity to care. In helping Sophie, he had transformed part of himself as well. He found that life could be richer, fuller, when you opened yourself up to another person's pain and allowed them to lean on you. This was not a story where the hero simply rode off into the sunset. It was a story of life continuing after the worst storms, of healing that ebbed and flowed, of scars that might ache but also served as reminders of survival. Sophie's journey did not end with the final confrontation in the cabin. Instead, it became the foundation upon which she built her future. And so, a month after the rescue turned into half a year, then more. As seasons came and went, the memory of that terrible night at the cabin receded into the background, overshadowed by the gentle hum of everyday life: school dances, summer art camps, family dinners, winter holidays. In each of these small, cherished moments, Sophie could feel the echo of what she had lost, but she also felt the abundant promise of what she had gained. Fairview never forgot the tragedy entirely. Towns rarely do. But the story that lingered most in people's minds was not just the horror of Brandon Warren's crimes. It was the story of a quiet mailman who heard a frightened plea for help, of a little girl who overcame unimaginable fear, and of a community that ultimately rallied to protect one of its own. It was a testament to the power of compassion, the courage it takes to survive, and the unbreakable bond that can form between two souls who meet under the most dire of circumstances. In the end, Sophie Warren's life was not defined by the day she begged for help, nor the day she was kidnapped in the dead of night. Instead, it was defined by every day that came after, every choice she made to live fully, and every piece of art that poured from her heart onto blank canvas, revealing something new, something hopeful. And in those paintings, in the swirl of colors that spoke of pain transcended, she found a way to speak to the world. I survived, and so can you. And so, the conflict that had once threatened to consume her faded into a memory. The last lingering shadows of Brandon's reach were locked away with him, leaving Sophie free to embrace her future. As she stepped forward into that future, supported by Mike, the marshals, and the many good people in Fairview, she carried a steadfast belief that even in the darkest times, compassion can be a beacon, guiding lost souls to safety, and sometimes, to one another. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, make sure to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Feel free to hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Thank you.